Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Laura, for organising this webinar, and thanks to the speakers, Ruth Dunlop-Price and Bridget Anderson, and thanks mainly to everyone who's joined us, you're all from different activities, jobs, backgrounds, working with policy in academia, and focusing on migration and refugee issues. So I hope this is going to be a very fruitful discussion. We're going to record the presentations, but not the interventions and questions. So what we'll do is, first of all, we'll hear from Ruth, and then we'll have a short break. If you've got any points of clarification that you can put for factual clarification, then Bridget will speak, and then we'll launch into the Q&A session. And I think it's a bit easier to manage if you put your questions in chat or indicate that you want to speak. And I think, Laura, if somebody wants to speak, you can activate the voice, the sound, can't you? Will you be activating the picture, the video?
I will enable it, and they can do it if they want.
So if people want to, so if you want to be seen and you want to be heard, you can put activate your camera and the sound. If you only want to be heard, do the sound. And if you want to just put a question in the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with, we'll try and make sure that we involve everyone who wants to speak or intervene in the chat and Q&A. So we've only got an hour, so I'm going to introduce Ruth Dunlop-Price straight away, and she will probably embellish with more information, because we've not met before, even though we work in the same areas, policy areas. So it's very interesting to hear a different perspective than I've heard up to now. So Ruth works together with refugees, an organisation, an NGO that is engaged in policy discussions with the current government, and Ruth's going to tell us something about the challenges and the opportunities that she faces, and the difficulties, and some of the positive side perhaps as well. So Ruth's going to speak about that, and then I'll introduce Bridget when we get to Bridget's turn to speak. So Ruth, please go ahead, and thank you for your intervention in advance. Thank you. I think you'd speak for 15 to 20 minutes each speaker. Thank you.
Oh, hi everyone, and thank you so much for having me. As Anne said, I'm Ruth Dunlop-Price. I'm the Campaigns and Public Affairs Lead at Together Refugees, and Together Refugees is a coalition of over 600 organisations, national and local, campaigning for a fairer asylum system. I will caveat before I start speaking that because we're such a broad coalition, definitely my reflections on engaging with this new government and some of the challenges, as well as some of the successes with that, are definitely a kind of broad overview. I'm aware every different member of Together Refugees has their own strategy and way of working, but this is just some reflections based on the conversations that we've been having with our members and some of the things that they've been reflecting back to us. And also I'm really keen, and I know we have time for this, but I'm also really keen to hear others' reflections on how they've sort of developed strategies to engage with this new government and this new political dynamic. So any sort of reflections on what I say, or any disagreements on what I say, would be more than welcome. So I think it's probably helpful, and sorry that it's not giving you a full shared screen. I'm having a slight laptop issue, so I'm on a colleague's laptop at the moment, which I can't quite work, but I will make sure these slides are shared afterwards. But I thought it's helpful to start off, if we can bear it, to go back thinking about the previous government and what engagement looked like with that previous government in terms of policy and practice. I'm sure, as you all know, and will all remember all too well, that the last government really not only attacked and decimated refugee rights in this country and migrant rights in this country, but also came after and attacked refugee charities and our structures and our organisations. And I think a lot of, charities and organisations that we work with felt really personally attacked by politicians, by the media, by others. And I think, we became used to being seen as, a bad actor to that government. That was obviously incredibly challenging, incredibly difficult, and particularly how a lot of charities and organisations were portrayed by the media, but also then reflected by politicians, made it really hard. And unsurprisingly, coupled with that kind of public rhetoric about charity, about refugee support, about legal support, about policy support, there was very limited, if not no, engagement from the last government with charities. And that sort of ranged from technical expertise and evidence and, you know, best practice all the way to political level and engagement with ministers. I came into this job in 2023, having worked in the humanitarian sector, where we would often complain about our engagement with the Foreign Office and often complain about our engagement with government. I have to say, compared to the refugee and asylum sector, we had a lot of engagement. It wasn't perfect, no engagement is, but, you know, the sort of very simple functions of what the government would call stakeholder management just didn't exist. You know, we were not consulted on legislation, on new strategies, on new policy development. Our evidence wasn't taken into account. You know, we at one point were not we as Together Refugees were not receiving replies to our letters that were sent to ministers. You know, really fundamental things that are important to me, not just for, you know, best practice and best policy, but also for sort of democratic oversight and how a government should function and engage with civil society organisations. So that's really all to say, under the last government, it wasn't very good at all, which I'm sure you're all aware of. I think the sort of counter to that and the slightly more challenging point to that is I think that then in itself meant that it was relatively easy to engage on refugee issues in the public and media space, because we were not concerned about whether we were tarnishing our relationship with the government, or we were, you know, going to be in trouble, or, you know, there was going to be any backlash to any of our public campaigning and our public work, because that relationship just didn't exist. And I think it meant for lots of organisations, you could develop campaigns, you could develop advocacy strategies that were really about positioning ourselves against a government, and that kind of, you know, good versus bad position, which you can see in this graphic that I dug out from the Rwanda policy. And so I think, you know, as much as a large amount of the blame for those bad relationships sits with the last government, I think as a sector, we also kind of, you know, responded to it and developed strategies and campaigns that wouldn't have helped us build relationships if we'd have wanted to. So then obviously we knew there was going to be a new government, and I think there's been lots of discussion, and this is where there's definitely disagreement and discussion within Together Refugees members was around, you know, how much do we shift, knowing there's going to be a Labour government, to a more insider engagement and focus more on building that relationship with particularly the Home Office and Number 10. And again, like I said, previously, a lot of different organisations have taken different positions on this, but I think the kind of general approach has been to kind of reframe some of our messaging and some of our campaigning positions in order to build those relationships, or attempt to build those relationships. I think, you know, the graphic that I showed in my previous slide of the sort of Prime Minister flying against humanity, I don't think you would see that from many organisations under this government, and that is in large part because they are trying to build those relationships. And I think some of this started in the pre-election period, and as I've noted, trying to build relationships with candidates and key officials within the Labour Party, and also attempting to influence the manifesto process. I think there are, and I should be really explicit about this, there are definitely really strong, clear lines that organisations across the board would not change their messaging for, and would not move towards government positioning. And I don't think we are yet in a space where there is a risk of any organisations doing that. I think there are things that as a sort of wide church coalition we will always stand to and oppose, but I think our kind of framing and how we position ourselves alongside the government and how we position ourselves as working with the government has massively changed. So I wanted to share this slide. I use this quite a lot in presentations because I guess I'm sort of now getting onto what it's actually been like engaging government. I guess the most important bit of context, which again I'm sure you're all aware of, is that asylum and wider migration issues are still headline news. I think for lots of us working in this sector, our kind of dream is that we're never in the news again, and that the sort of politics is taken out of a lot of this, and it becomes a kind of technical thing that the government manages with compassion and efficiency. But that hasn't happened. I think probably every day there is a new headline about the asylum system, the challenges in the asylum system, the government's plans for the asylum system, and that makes it an incredibly difficult space to be engaging government in and campaigning on. So what has worked well, or what have been the positives with our engagement with the new government? So I think, first of all, it's important to acknowledge we have had some successes. There have been some big news stories and big policy developments that are in part of some of the campaigning work that we've been involved in. So things like scrapping the Rwanda scheme and the Bibi Stockholm barge were things that a lot of our members had been working on for a number of years and happened very quickly after the new government came in place. So that is a positive and a demonstration that some of that work had an impact. I think there has also been some behind the scenes reform that we're seeing from this government. It's kind of the stuff that they whisper about rather than press release, but they are making some changes to the asylum system. And I think particularly thinking about some of the work the ACH2 and others, thinking about the move on period and the sort of progress that has been made there through some sort of very behind the scenes technical conversations with the Home Office and other departments, shows that you can bring about change on issues. There has been some improved engagement with the Home Office. I put some stakeholder management because it's not perfect, but we've definitely seen the political office within the Home Office has made clear that they need to engage with charities and organisations working to support refugees. So we have definitely seen an improvement there. And we've also seen a small bit, it's not loads, but we have seen some improvements in how the Home Office is engaging with other departments. One of the big challenges that we've always had is that the Home Office felt like this entire separate kind of state that wasn't connected in with wider government policy and decision making. And we are seeing that particularly around communities and local government and housing and other things, that's slightly changing. And then the final thing that we are seeing is improved relationships at a local level with new Labour MPs. I think a lot of our members have a new MP and they're putting a lot of work into building those relationships, and we're seeing that starting to pay off. And then move on to the challenges, which are probably slightly longer. First of all, in honesty, that local engagement isn't yet leading to lots of parliamentary activity and action, particularly from Labour MPs. I think lots of MPs are willing to come to a local event, meet people with lived experience, potentially show their support for a local charity, say the nice things about that organisation. But then when they're asked a policy or a political point, or asked to vote in a certain way, speak to the Home Secretary about a certain thing, that's where the kind of challenge fits. And I think there's a very obvious reason for that, and I won't dwell on this because I'm sure you're all aware of it, and that is entirely where Number 10 and the Labour government is on this issue. I think particularly at the moment, and in really since the Christmas period, they've really been feeling under quite a lot of pressure and really struggle to control their narrative about, what their vision is, what their plan is, what these missions are that they love talking about. And unfortunately, when that is the case with governments, migration and asylum is an issue that they come back to and that they talk about more. And I think it's very clear to us, and from conversations that we're having with people around that government, that they really internalised particularly the Trump election and what that said to them about migration, which I think particularly this week and with what's going on in America feels really worrying. And also that they've kind of internalised that polling success that we saw from Reform and the success they had in the local elections. And that means that, Labour MPs, the Home Office, others at a senior level are really limiting their engagement with refugee charities, refugee organisations. So while we're getting that kind of technical practical engagement with some members in the Home Office. We're not getting that senior political engagement that we need. And again, I was thinking back when I was preparing this presentation about how in previous jobs we've engaged with ministers, and you know, the kind of idea that you'd have a quarterly meeting where charities would go and meet with the Foreign Secretary and there'd be a nice graphic and picture on social media. We're very far from doing that with the vet Cooper. We're not in a position where we're all going to be around a table with her and she's going to be publicising that she met with us as a positive. And I think the thing that it always comes back to, for me and for us at Together Refugees, is that we are incredibly confident that if you speak to the general public, if you poll the general public, if you go into communities, there is support for refugees and welcoming refugees. When you dig into that a bit more, it becomes a bit trickier, but the kind of overall sense that the UK should be doing its part, it should be compassionate, it should have a refugee system that allows people to rebuild their lives, all of those things, we know, or we believe that Together Refugees, there is support for that. The fundamental problem we have is that the government doesn't believe us. They don't see that when they, you know, do their own analysis. They don't see that when they think about the particular voters that they're worried about. They don't see that, you know, when local Labour activists go door knocking and speak to people in their communities. And unless the government believes that and sees that, all the other stuff that we've spoken about in terms of the level of engagement we get is going to be limited because the political calculations are there. So I've tried to end on a slight positive, which is what it could all mean and what we could do about some of those challenges. I mean, first thing to say, it's still early doors in terms of building relationships with new MPs. It's, you know, we're nearly a year since the election, but, you know, we definitely still have time to be building those local relationships and getting them to be more active in Parliament. The second thing is hopefully some of the political landscapes around Labour will be changing. I think particularly looking at the local elections for next year, including lots of elections in London, as well as potentially what may happen in Scotland and Wales, may mean that they have to recalculate some of that focus on reform and also think about more progressive forces. I think the kind of experience from the Move On reform and from other reforms that we've seen in the asylum system suggests that that sort of quiet, effective, behind the scenes engagement does work and can bring about change. And then the other kind of two things that I'll just highlight here are kind of, we have an opportunity to bring in allies and voices that we know the government are listening to, and that's something that we at Together Refugees spend a lot of time doing, is thinking about, okay, well, if the government have got their set of, you know, key voters, how do we bring them into these discussions? And it's a, you know, classic campaigning trick, but we definitely have the opportunity to do that. And also we have the opportunity to be more public in demonstrating how much support there is for refugees. And that can be difficult and it can feel really challenging, but that's what at Together Refugees we feel is really important, to change that calculation for the government and to change what they're doing. And I'm aware I'm kind of offering a slightly contradictory list because some of it's about, you know, quiet long-term change around, you know, having those technical conversations with government, having those kind of long-term relationship building with MP, and then some of it's about being big and public and campaigny. But I think they can work together. I think you can craft strategies that do both, and you can craft engagement that, you know, does both the kind of behind the scenes and the outsider work. And that's what we're trying to do at Together Refugees. And I'd be really welcome reflections from others on this call about, you know, your own strategies and engaging with this government and with MPs and how you're finding that. But yeah, I will leave it there and pass back to Anna.
Thank you very much for a remarkably positive presentation there. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions and points to discuss at the end after Bridget has also spoken. But just before we move to Bridget's presentation, has anyone got any questions about kind of points of fact or interpretation that need clarifying before we move on? If I don't see any indications, we'll just move on to Bridget. Hey, Oh, there's somebody there. Yes. I can't see who it is, but there's a hand up there. SD. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Shamshada Shani. Yeah, please.
That's
please
right.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much for allowing this question. I just want to query the figure of the 80% support. You said that the government doesn't believe it. You know, in the way in which this information was collected, are there people perhaps who would shy away from saying that, no, I don't support something that is obviously morally, you know, the right thing to do? So, you know, what is your view as somebody who's involved in the thick of it about that figure in relation to my question? I'm not disputing that it's high. You know, we have a compassionate country generally, but I'm just wondering whether it's as high as 80%.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Shamshad. They've got one more point question from Nadine Finch. So I think we'll take that from Nadine, and then Ruth can answer both points in the summing up of the summary. So Nadine, please go ahead.
Hi, Ruth. I'm a member of the Refugee and Migrant Children's Consortium, who also is a very large one. And we've been campaigning on issues around migrant children from the beginning of the 1990s. And I have to say, our analysis of this present government is very different. We have been on a lot of bodies. I was an attention working party with the government for a number of years in the 90s. Things have deteriorated very, very much since then. And I think that we are not surprised, but we are disheartened by the number of doors being slammed in the face of charities and refugee groups. I can say more about that later, either in the meeting or to you personally, but that is not our experience, and we're having to do workarounds. So we're working now with a number of non-Labour MPs and other groups, because I have a much more, I'm older, I have a much more cynical view of the Labour Party's history of migration.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Nadine. So, Ruth, would you like to respond to those 2 points and interventions?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for sharing. And yeah, like I said, I think Nadine, to respond to your reflections, I think this is definitely kind of an overview across lots of different organisations and different parts of the asylum and refugee system. And I think maybe it would have been helpful for me to kind of specify that those doors are open and that engagement is improving on areas that the government is interested in, rather than all areas of the system. And I think we're definitely seeing there are some areas that kind of are more in line with where the government is willing to move and willing to engage. And then there are areas where the door is, as you said, unfortunately, very firmly shut. And there's really big, important things that we care deeply about. And I'm sure others on this call care deeply about, like, you know, the right for asylum seekers to work while they're waiting for their claim to be processed, particularly if they've been in the system for a long time, that the government has just absolutely completely closed the door on for the moment, which is really upsetting. So yeah, I should have probably specified that it's kind of on government terms where the access is coming from, which in itself is difficult, I think. And again, we probably don't have time to go into this in this call, and I don't want to monopolise. I think, Bridget, I'm sure you will have some interesting reflections as well as sort of general government engagement with charities across lots of different issues. And I agree, it's not in the place it should be. And I think that kind of devaluing of charities and their expertise is sort of there across the board. But yeah, I'm very happy to pick up after this call as well, if helpful. And then, yeah, on the 80% figure, I mean, this is some research that we did last year. And we use it a lot together, refugees, partly because we feel it's motivational for our members and sort of remind our members that there is that level of support. But I think your reflection is kind of maybe why we shouldn't focus on statistics, because they can always be challenged and they should always be challenged. And, you know, we Together Refugees and lots of other organisations are always producing data showing how much support there is for refugees. But if it's not believable, and if it's not what the government feels and sees, then what value does it have? So we use it mainly for our own peace of mind and to keep us going, because otherwise I think we might slightly lose the faith. But I agree, the kind of just telling the government, well, actually 80% of people are supportive of refugees is not going to win the day. And also that figure is based on a very broad question that we use with the pollsters, which is around, generally supporting a refugee system. So it's really not digging into what that system should look like and exactly what policies should be included. So I'm sure if you dug further in, those numbers would reduce as well. But yeah, I'm happy to share that polling if anyone's particularly interested in the weeds of the data.
Yes, please. Thanks very much for that. I think everyone would be interested to see the data evidence that you've quoted there. So I think we should move quite swiftly on to, perhaps this would help to locate what's happening in its historical context rather than in just the time frame of the current government, because the current government is in many ways following the same trajectory as previous governments, and the optimism may be how you keep going, but perhaps it's not warranted. So now we have Bridget Anderson, who's going to give her reflections. Bridget is the Director of Migration Mobilities Bristol, and she's worked for many years in academic research, but also in activist work with NGOs, with refugees, campaigning for people for civil liberties and human rights. And so Bridget's perspective will be perhaps a slightly different one, and I think it's very productive that we can have a discussion around that. So thank you, Ruth, for a very clear presentation of your information, and I'm looking forward now to also hear from Bridget. So Bridget, please go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Anne, and thanks, Ruth. That was really clear and actually really interesting. So I'm kind of I wanted to talk about how migration and asylum research, organising and campaigning has changed over time. And I wanted to bring together both my kind of personal experience and my research to sort of reflect on that. So I'm partly going to talk about my own individual experience, but also kind of things that I've learned in my research. But I think I would sort of take as my starting point that actually all migration and refugee research and advocacy and support is, like it or not, political, with a small p. So it's not associated with political parties, but more that it comes, I think, from a concern with justice or equality or anti-racism or rights, and that these actually, they're just unavoidably political. So I'm interested then in what happens when, so my work really is interested in when and how humanitarianism that tries to be apolitical then comes to feature really strongly in migration related work. And I suppose I do this from the spirit of being a critical friend, because I actually came from the migrant organising sector in the 1980s. I kind of know how difficult I have an appreciation of the multiple challenges and compromises that people just have to make, and the difficult decisions that people have to make. So it's kind of, and I respect that, and I recognise the kind of privilege of being in academia. But I also think that privilege sort of can help us then ask questions which are meant to be productive. And I think, so I suppose, I want to think about the risks of engagement with government. So not saying no engagement, but just like open-eyed engagement, open-eyed, maybe learning from history. So because I basically first became involved in migrant organising in the mid-1980s when I was organising undocumented migrant domestic workers, which kind of at the time was quite, the idea of undocumented workers and organising was sort of like very much, that was quite an unusual thing, even though now it's kind of quite mainstream. But on reflection, when I look back on it, I realised that was really very much, so my involvement in sort of like the mid-80s came in very much at the tail end of post-World War II migrant organising. So we were still at the stage when activists and organisers basically took colonialism's legacy and racism as absolutely central to their work. So there were lots of protests at the double standards regarding differential rights to come to the UK, and immigration and citizenship were kind of seen as expressions of continual racialized, colonial and class subjugation. So famously, Stephen Andan said, "We are here because you were there." And, you know, that wasn't just sort of like a sort of ivory tower thing. That very much was the kind of sentiment. And so there was this kind of direct relationship and recognition of the connection between immigration law and racism. So there was like, immigration law is racist, and it's a continuity between colonialism and immigration controls. So anti-deportation struggles were very much part of the anti-racist movement, and often challenged immigration laws as a manifestation of racism and colonial legacies. So there was a very famous anti-deportation campaign that I was partially involved in for somebody called Viraj Mendes, who's also a great activist. And he described it like this, and I'm quoting, he said, "The thing is that people from the third world who are victims of colonial history from the UK, they are very poor, and England is very rich. And the wealth of England is the result of the poverty of the third world. And therefore, this is why immigration laws have to be racist. It cannot be anything else." So that was the kind of, I suppose, the ethos, the general kind of background of migrant organising at that time. But it's also worth saying, I think, that, and this is a kind of an unacknowledged difference, I think, is that migrant organising was focused on workers. And I think if you look at the kind of ways in which people think about the history of migrant organising, you can see that there was, like, you know, you can think about the Grunwick strike, for example. But there was, so migrant organising was about workers, and it was about family members of workers, and it was not really very much focused on asylum. So there were campaigns that were concerned with refugees, but there was, I think, a kind of, it was seen as quite exceptional. And so in our work with undocumented domestic workers, we did sort of work a lot with groups like the African Refugee Housing Action Group. We learned a lot from the work that they were doing, but like refugees were the more, in a way, they were seen as like, it was migrant workers who were at the kind of grubby end of the spectrum. And there was a certain kind of, I don't know, it was just, yeah, there was a certain, refugees were perceived differently. And I think that was also partly because of public perception. So as I say, we work with like the, with, I don't know, the Tamil Action Group, the anti-apartheid activists, like, so lots of refugee groups. But actually in people's minds, I think that at that time, the idea of the refugee was basically from the Soviet Union, the ballet dancer, the novelist. You know, there was a very sort of, so in public debate, I think that had quite a strong traction, which obviously is very different from today. And I think that the end of the Cold War was quite important in this. There was a significant increase in asylum claims. So I was looking up the figures. In 1988, there were just under 4,000 asylum applications, and in 1991, there were 44,000. So there was a big jump. And there was also a diversification of people's countries of origin, and a kind of shift, as I say, through the imagination of the kind of white liberal political refugee fleeing kind of communism, to the idea of Black or Muslim asylum seekers who was running away from a failed state, or actually actively trying to game the system. So by the end of the 90s, we'd seen the kind of political refugee become the bogus asylum seeker, whose claims were far more contested. The bogus asylum seeker, like the idea of that as a figure, I think, would have made much less sense in the age of the Cold War. And I actually remember when the term asylum seeker entered the public consciousness, which should have been like around 2000s, because I was chatting on the school run to one of the other mums, and she was talking about asylum seekers. And I thought, I was quite surprised. I thought like, oh, wouldn't have expected her to be kind of sympathetic to the situation of, she was talking about Albanian people. And I realized, but then as she went on talking, I realized, oh, she's not sympathetic at all. But it was because, you know, when you used the term asylum seeker, that showed that you knew something about the process by which people got refugee status. So it kind of signified that you were sort of like, you were kind of knowledgeable, which would quite often mean that you were sympathetic. But I saw that she wasn't at all. So, and then you had this new adjective that could get stuck onto asylum seeker, which is bogus. So this was not a depoliticization of migration and asylum. And but I do think in the 97 election, when New Labour got in, there was some discussion of immigration, but it wasn't a major issue. And in terms of our campaigning around undocumented domestic workers, we'd done the kind of quiet talking to people about, you know, we want to change the visa, and we want regularization for people who have been made undocumented because of the system so far. And we actually recorded that. So we were quite canny in those times, and we actually recorded them. So we had recordings of commitments that were made by Labour in opposition. So we were able to use that, and we won our campaign, but there were lots of issues with it, which I'll happily go into if people are interested, because it wasn't as easy as one might have thought. And you don't really hear about the regularization of domestic workers, though there was a regularization. And then we were put into the situation of, okay, so you don't like the current the current system. So now, you know, what are you going to suggest? What immigration rule are you going to suggest for domestic workers? So there was a lot of debate about whether we should engage with that or not. But more generally, I think we can say that it was under the New Labour government that we saw immigration and asylum becoming like increasingly important. So 2001, asylum was really very prominent, and media and politicians were really portraying asylum seekers as a growing concern. And I actually would say that Tony Blair's introduction of the tipping point, I don't know, Nadine might remember this, but when it was, well, you know, we want to be removing or deporting more asylum seekers than we are admitting. I think that was really the beginning of this obsession with numbers and with the idea of the net migration figure. So it's a tipping point. And by 2005, we saw that immigration and asylum really becoming central issues in the election campaign. And the Conservative ran the campaign, which had slogans like, are you thinking what we're thinking? Which focused on limiting immigration and tightening asylum. And Labour responded by emphasising their own, you know, how tough they were on immigration control. So a bit like today, both parties basically feeling pressure to address what they imagine are public concerns. But also, this ran alongside a humanitarianising of migration. So we went from actually having very kind of like anti-racist, anti-imperialist campaigning to a much more kind of humanitarian approaches. And I think this was because before the 97 election, the Labour Party had really worked quite closely with campaigning and advocacy groups across a wide range of issues. So not just immigration and asylum, so like housing and domestic violence, other kinds of issues. And so when it came to power, it drew on those relationships to establish partnerships with what they call third sector organisations across different areas of social policy. And the sort of thinking was, they said, you know, these third sector organisations were closer to their so-called clients. So this became the terminology, clients. And so they would be better at delivering certain services. And so they established a framework of relationships between government and third sector. And I'm quoting, it was to work for the betterment of society and to nurture and support voluntary community activity. So there was actually, probably as there is today, like a lot of discussion within the movement, which I think was fast becoming a sector, about independence, loss of autonomy, but then it was also welcomed by some of the bigger players. And actually, it was really the refugee sector, rather than the migrant one, I think, that became a significant part of this process. And we saw this with the Refugee Council, which worked closely with government on integration, support and accommodation. Refugee Action partnered with government on dispersal schemes. Migrant Helpline worked to deliver asylum support services. So they became very key intermediaries between the state and asylum seekers, and refugee support services became far more professionalised. And actually, this was happening at a time of considerable legislative change. So we had the 1999 Immigration and Asylum Act, which really was the beginning, I would say, of a real onslaught against non-citizens' rights to access public services. The extension of NRPF to anyone subject to immigration control, the introduction of NAS, the National Asylum Support Service, a sort of parallel system for asylum seekers, and actually a lot of charities became established in response to dispersal and NAS. So local authorities and private providers took up contracts for the provision of services and worked closely with government in the provision of services. And again, there was a lot of debate between people who were differently positioned within the sector. But some groups said it was actually much more difficult for the sector to challenge systemic injustice, and that more critical organisations challenging deportations were kind of excluded. And then we had the 2002 Nationality, Immigration and Asylum Act, which also withdrew the concession granting asylum seekers permission to work. So that was a new Labour policy. And then we also saw, though, the legal basis for the Gateway Protection Scheme, which allowed for a quota of UNHCR designated particularly vulnerable refugees. And I think in a way, this Gateway Protection Scheme sort of marked a shift of a new way to be protected, which is going to be attainable by the most vulnerable refugees. So status became sort of very much also associated with the extremity of vulnerability and suffering. And I think that we've seen now the proliferation of specific schemes for different so-called vulnerable groups, and also kind of targeted schemes for Ukrainians and people from Hong Kong. So I suppose I'm kind of interested that in academia, but I would also say actually around activism, and I think particularly around migration organising, there is a kind of renewed recognition of the relation between racism and anti-migration politics. And we also saw this in the riots last year, which were kind of cast as being anti-migrant, and in some places were even sort of described as, you know, well, these are illegitimate protests, but they come from legitimate grievances about immigration. These were racist riots. They didn't check people's passports to see whether they were going to kind of be beaten up or allowed to pass the kind of barricades. It was actually to do with race and racism. And I think that so I think that this kind of rediscovery of the importance of racism and political economy, global political economy, which is, I would argue, continues to be neo-colonial. But I think there's a lot to be learned from this and from joining up, I think, the lessons of migrant organising, advocacy and campaigning from the post-war period and what happens today. And so we need to see that race and racism matters, that history matters, global political economy matters. I think as well we need to be cautious in appeals to deservingness and victimization, however they get represented, because they can just sort of tangle us into hierarchies of suffering and who's more deserving than another. So on the one hand, I think, you know, we are in a different context. We are also in a context where liberal institutions are being undermined from the right. But perhaps what that's telling us is we need to learn from, for example, prison abolitionism and the idea of non-reformist reforms, and building a different kind of world as well as criticising the current one. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Bridget. I think the question now that I'll put to everyone is, how do we do that? What next? What are the next steps? So I'm welcome any interventions or comments or questions from everyone, from the attendees at this webinar. Please raise your hand or indicate, and if Laura could tell me if I'm missing someone. We will not be recording from now on, so what you say will not be recorded. So I hope you feel free to say what you think. Yeah. So there is a point in the chat there.